Good morning, and welcome to our live coverage of the launch of Hotbird 13G, a commercial communications satellite awaiting liftoff on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket this morning from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, the editor of Spaceflight Now, and welcome to our live coverage. You're looking at a live view of the Falcon 9 standing vertical out on pad 40 this morning, as liftoff is targeted for 1:22 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That is 5:22 a.m. UTC for those of you watching in other time zones around the world. The Falcon 9 was rolled to the pad on Wednesday, yesterday, in preparation for this launch tonight. The roughly two-hour launch window actually opened at 11:26 p.m. nearly an hour ago now. But SpaceX pushed back this launch to allow additional time for pre-flight checkouts and preparations. So the launch is now targeted for 1:22 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC, at the end of tonight's nearly two-hour launch window. So the two-hour launch window is now effectively instantaneous. So the launch needs to happen at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, or else it will have to wait until at least tomorrow night, a 24-hour delay. But right now, we're not aware of any issues that would prevent a launch at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, the payload on this mission is Hotbird 13G. It's a commercial television broadcasting satellite owned by Eutelsat, based in Paris, France. It's one of the world's largest geostationary satellite operators. The spacecraft was built by Airbus Defence and Space, also in France, and again has been delivered to Cape Canaveral a few weeks ago and is now enclosed inside SpaceX's payload fairing on top of the Falcon 9. As you can see, the clock in the upper right is the clock ticking down to launch time. So the countdown is now passing T-minus 1 hour, 60 minutes remaining until the scheduled liftoff time for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket this morning. Again, that launch time is targeted for 1:22 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC, to begin the second SpaceX launch in less than 2 days here on Florida's Space Coast. A Falcon Heavy rocket launched on Wednesday from pad 39A, and tonight SpaceX is preparing to launch a Falcon 9 rocket from pad 40 a few miles to the south. Here's a replay of that Falcon Heavy launch that occurred at 9:41 a.m. Eastern Time yesterday from Launch Complex 39A, just 3 or 4 miles, or about 5 miles actually, north of the pad 40 area. You can see this heavy lift rocket powered by 3 Falcon rocket cores, 27 main engines, climbing off of pad 39A in very foggy conditions. Remarkably, very little visibility of the launch itself from our location, just a few miles away from the pad. But those lucky enough to be in positions of clear air and pockets of clear air got glimpses of the Falcon Heavy as it climbed through the atmosphere. You can see here this is from a tracking camera a little farther away from the launch pad, showing the Falcon Heavy climbing into space, heading east from Kennedy Space Center. This mission delivered to orbit several payloads for the U.S. Space Force. 2 main payloads were on board. One of them was the Shepard demonstration spacecraft. That's a technology demonstration mission that the Space Force says will test out new technologies related to rendezvous and proximity operations in geosynchronous orbit. Those technologies could be useful for future military missions that are providing surveillance services of other objects in geosynchronous orbit, or could approach other objects or other satellites for inspections in geosynchronous orbit. And those technologies are also potentially useful in satellite servicing. The other payload on board was the long-duration propulsive ESPA payload that carries 6 technology demonstration payloads for the Space Force. So we saw that Falcon 9 climb off the pad heading to orbit, and then here is a view about 8 minutes later of the 2 side boosters. After they jettisoned from the core stage, they made their way back to landing zones 1 and 2 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Really spectacular views of the 2 Falcon Heavy side boosters making nearly simultaneous landings at landing zones 1 and 2, about 9 miles south of the departure point for that Falcon Heavy rocket from pad 39A. This was the 4th launch of a Falcon Heavy rocket since SpaceX debuted the launch vehicle. Its first test flight was back in 2018. And it was the first Falcon Heavy that's flown in more than 3 years. The last was in June of 2019. Several of these Falcon Heavy missions that are on the books have been delayed by payload or satellite problems. This particular mission was delayed about 2 years by payload readiness issues. But we saw the Falcon Heavy make its 4th successful launch yesterday. Actually, now 2 days ago, Tuesday, since we've passed the clock into Thursday, November 3rd here in Florida. And less than 48 hours later, a Falcon 9 is awaiting liftoff from pad 40, a few miles to the south of where the Falcon Heavy took off on Tuesday. The sole payload for tonight's mission is Hotbird 13G. This spacecraft is owned by Eutelsat, a Paris-based geostationary satellite operator with several dozen communication satellites in orbit. It was built by Airbus Defence and Space. It's based on the new Eurostar Neo platform. This is a new spacecraft design that has upgraded power and thermal control systems and can accommodate more powerful communications payloads than earlier generations of Airbus-built communications satellites. This is a twin of the Hotbird 13F satellite, which, if you have followed recent SpaceX launches, you'll know that that mission launched back on October the 15th, a little more than 2 weeks ago, from Pad 40 here at Cape Canaveral. Hotbird 13G at launch weighs about 10,000 pounds. That's about 4.5 metric tons. The Falcon 9 rocket will place this satellite into what's known as a super synchronous transfer orbit with an apogee or high point stretching more than 30,000 miles or more than 50,000 kilometers above the Earth. The low point will be just a few hundred miles above the planet. And then the spacecraft will use all-electric plasma thrusters to slowly maneuver itself into a circular geosynchronous orbit over the equator. That'll take several months using these low thrust but very, very fuel efficient plasma thrusters. It'll enter geosynchronous orbit sometime next year and then maneuver to an operating position at 13 degrees east right alongside its twin satellite Hotbird 13F, which is already making these orbit raising maneuvers after its launch last month. In geosynchronous orbit, these two satellites will orbit the planet in lockstep with the Earth's rotation, so it'll give these satellites a fixed coverage area over Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, providing television broadcast services using 80 KU band transponders, broadcasting hundreds of TV channels to Eutelsat customers across these regions. Hotbird 13F and 13G, these two new satellites replace 3 aging Hotbird satellites at this orbital position. So with advances in technology, Eutelsat only needs 2 new generation Hotbird satellites to replace and expand on the services provided by 3 older generation satellites. I mentioned these 2 satellites, Hotbird 13F and 13G, are virtually identical. And here's a view, an artist concept of these 2 satellites as they would appear in their fully deployed configuration in geosynchronous orbit with their solar panels extended and their communications antennas unfurled after launch. So again, Hotbird 13F is on the way to its orbital position in geosynchronous orbit now after launching last month on a Falcon 9 rocket from here at the Cape. Hotbird 13G, launching this morning, will follow a few weeks behind. We're now back with a full screen view of Pad 40 showing the Falcon 9 rocket. Now 46 minutes from the target launch time this morning. The next major milestone in the countdown will be the start of propellant loading that is due to begin at T-minus 35 minutes.
launch countdown net. Reminder, step 59.72, propellant load and launch go, no-go. Poll is open for your buy at this time. Still looking for buys from CE, RC, and ground stations.
SpaceX's countdown is now at T-minus 42 minutes, 10 seconds and counting. We're now listening to some periodic calls from SpaceX Launch Control. SpaceX's launch control team is stationed in a control center a few miles to the south of Pad 40 near the south gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And the SpaceX launch director is currently polling his team for a go or no-go for propellant loading. So each console position will report their status and their readiness to start loading kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket at Pad 40. Here's an overview of the countdown timeline. That poll should be completed by T-minus 38 minutes, just a few minutes from now. And then if all stations report go for propellant loading and launch, RP1 kerosene fueling and liquid oxygen loading will begin on the first stage at T-minus 35 minutes. At the same time, kerosene will also begin flowing into the second stage.
We'll go for propellant load and launch.
And we just heard from SpaceX's launch director that the pre-launch poll is complete. All stations reported go for propellant loading and launch at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:22 UTC. So jumping back to this countdown timeline, what to expect throughout the countdown this morning. Again, propellant loading should begin at T-minus 35 minutes. At T-minus 20 minutes or so, the kerosene tank on the second stage should be fully loaded. A few minutes later, at T-minus 16 minutes, liquid oxygen, the super cold cryogenic oxidizer, should begin flowing into the second stage. And then in the final 10 minutes of the countdown, the pace picks up with chill down conditioning of the Falcon 9's 9 Merlin 1D first stage engines at T-minus 7 minutes. At T-minus 5.5 minutes, the kerosene RP1 fuel tank on stage 1 should be full. At T-minus 4.5 minutes, we should see the strong back. That's the structure of the mast just to the right of the Falcon 9 that you can see here on the right side of your screen. That should begin retracting to a small angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket. At around T-minus 2 minutes, the Falcon 9 should be fully loaded with propellants. Again, I mentioned kerosene loading on stage 2 terminates at about T-minus 20 minutes. On stage 1, that ends at about T-minus 5 minutes 30 seconds. And at T-minus 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading should be complete on both stages. And at that point, the fill and drain valves on the Falcon 9 will be closed for flight. And that will actually allow, beginning in the final minute of the countdown, the propellant tanks, once the vent valves are closed, to begin pressurizing up to flight level. At T-minus 60 seconds also, the control of the countdown will be passed to the Falcon 9's onboard computer. SpaceX's launch director will give their final go for launch at T-minus 45 seconds. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller, the computer onboard the Falcon 9, will give the command to light the 9 first stage engines. That will be done with the aid of an igniter fluid called TTEB. That stands for triethylborane, triethyl aluminum. If you've watched SpaceX missions, or if you're watching tonight's launch, look out for a very brief but quite distinctive green flash. That's the green flame from the igniter fluid that will be followed by the orange glow that we're all accustomed to from the Merlin engines themselves. After a very quick computer-controlled automated health check of the engine performance, if everything looks good, the onboard computer on the Falcon 9 will give the command for hold-down clamps on the pad to release. That allows the Falcon 9 to begin its climb to space. So there's an overview of what we can expect to see over the next 38 minutes or so as SpaceX counts down to liftoff.
Venting tanks for prop load.
On countdown it, a reminder for abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD, and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold, hold, hold on this countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Coming up in just a few moments should be the call for auto sequence and the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket.
Launch auto sequence has started.
And there's the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch auto sequence has started. The countdown is now running on an automated computer sequencer, controlling the final preparations to configure the Falcon 9 for flight. At this time, propellants are now loading into the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. Both kerosene and liquid oxygen are flowing into the booster at this time. The upper stage of the Falcon 9 is now being loaded with kerosene fuel. That upper stage will be loaded one propellant at a time. Fuel first, followed by liquid oxygen, the oxidizer, later in the countdown, whereas with stage 1, SpaceX loads both propellants at the same time. Now T-minus 33 minutes and counting. Tonight's launch will mark the 51st launch of the year by SpaceX and the second SpaceX mission this week. As we mentioned earlier, the Falcon Heavy rocket launched on Tuesday from Pad 39A, a few miles north of the Falcon 9's launch pad being used this morning. That Falcon Heavy mission carried several U.S. Space Force payloads into orbit. That was a semi-classified mission. Many of the mission details for that Falcon Heavy launch were kept secret by the Space Force, although some basics of the payloads were disclosed by the military. That was the fourth Falcon Heavy launch overall, and it's one of as many as 6 Falcon Heavy missions that SpaceX plans to launch over the next year or so. Tonight, though, SpaceX is back to its workhorse, the Falcon 9, with a single-stick first-stage booster on a mission to deliver a commercial communications satellite for Eutelsat into a super-synchronous transfer orbit, a highly elliptical transfer orbit. On the way, ultimately, the satellite will ultimately maneuver itself into a circular geosynchronous orbit. If you look closely, you can now see some venting, some vapors at least, gathering around the first stage booster as super cold liquid oxygen flows into the rocket out at pad 40. The very lowest part of the booster, the first stage, is actually the kerosene tank. That's the fuel used by the Falcon 9's engines. Above that, about a third of the way up the booster, is the liquid oxygen tank, and the liquid oxygen is chilled to several hundred degrees below zero. And due to its cryogenic temperature, we'll see some frost and ice build up on the outer skin of the first stage booster. And this booster, launching this morning, is going to space for the 7th time. So it does have some scorch and soot markings. And that booster, those markings will become white when they're covered with ice. And if you look closely, you can basically track the propellant level, the liquid oxygen level in that tank as the frost and ice line rises up the height of that first stage booster. If you look closely behind the launch pad, you may have just seen one of the security helicopters doing a sweep of the offshore exclusion zone, the maritime exclusion zone that is kept clear of all ships and aircraft during a rocket launch. We may see that helicopter do another sweep later in the countdown. This is all part of the standard range safety effort to make sure there's no one in danger, no one under the flight path of the Falcon 9 as it climbs to space this morning. Again, the payload on this mission is Hotbird 13G. It was built by Airbus Defence and Space in Toulouse, France, and it was actually delivered to Kennedy Space Center back on October the 15th, just hours after its sister satellite, the identical Hotbird 13F, launched on a Falcon 9 rocket. Hours after that launch, Hotbird 13G arrived to prepare for tonight's launch. It was delivered by one of Airbus's Beluga heavy lift transport aircraft. And here are some images from Airbus Defence and Space showing the Beluga on the left departing the airport in Toulouse, France, next to the Airbus satellite factory where this Eutelsat Hotbird 13G satellite was assembled and tested. On the upper right, a view from Airbus showing the open nose cargo bay door allowing that Airbus container that held the Hotbird 13G satellite during transport, allowing it to come out of the aircraft for a transfer over to SpaceX's payload processing facility for final launch preparations. And on the lower right, a view of the Beluga aircraft parked on the apron at the launch and landing facility here at Kennedy Space Center. That's the same runway that was used during the Space Shuttle program for Space Shuttle landings. The aircraft landed on that runway, and the satellite was offloaded on the apron there. That photo comes from a Earth observation satellite, one of Airbus's Pleiad Earth observation satellites, showing Airbus's Beluga parked at Kennedy Space Center and the Airbus-built Hotbird 13G satellite being offloaded there to prepare for tonight's launch. We're going to play a video in a few moments showing the Hotbird 13G satellite. Here it is, a video from Airbus. We saw it being put into the container in Toulouse, France. And here is the container as it's being prepared to be for loading into the Airbus Beluga aircraft. The Beluga is normally used to transport airplane components such as tanks and wings and fuselage components for Airbus's commercial airplane business across Europe between different manufacturing sites. But Airbus used this, one of their Beluga aircraft used it to transfer the Hotbird 13G satellite across the Atlantic Ocean last month. You see the loading of the shipping container inside the nose of the Beluga aircraft here in Toulouse, France. And here's the departure of the Airbus Beluga, which is based on an Airbus A300 airliner, but it obviously has that large fuselage to carry outsized cargo. So there it was, departing Toulouse on the way to Kennedy Space Center last month. So we want to thank Airbus for providing that video for us. We're now back live at Kennedy Space Center, looking across the marsh here on Florida's Space Coast, a few miles away toward Pad 40 over at the adjacent Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. If you're just joining us, you're looking at a live view of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket standing 229 feet or 70 meters tall on Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, now 24 minutes, 18 seconds from liftoff. Propellant loading on board the Falcon 9 is progressing well this morning as SpaceX targets launch with the Eutelsat's Hotbird 13G satellite at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this exciting middle-of-the-night launch. Should be quite a show here at Cape Canaveral. We want to bring this to as many people as possible. So in order to do that, we need a little help from you. So please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That really helps us a lot. If you want to support our coverage, we have memberships available for you. You can join our YouTube channel. And depending on which membership tier you choose, you can gain access to exclusive members-only video features for our subscribers or for our members. You'll also be supporting our coverage. As you may know, there is a rapid growth in the launch rate here at Cape Canaveral, and in order to keep up, we need support from you to help us maintain and expand our coverage. So one way to do that is through our memberships here on YouTube by joining our YouTube channel. Another way you can support our coverage, if you enjoy our commentary and our live video, is to contribute in the Super Chat here on YouTube. We'd appreciate that as well. The launch is now less than 23 minutes away. Again, tonight's mission will target what's known as a super synchronous transfer orbit. That is a highly elliptical or oval-shaped orbit around the Earth with a high point stretching more than 30,000 miles from Earth. The low point will be just a few hundred miles above the surface of Earth. And this orbit is where the Hotbird 13G satellite will be deployed about 36 minutes after launch this morning on the way to its final geosynchronous orbit over the equator. In order to reach that equatorial orbit, the Falcon 9 rocket will head due east from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This map shows the approximate ground track the Falcon 9 will take heading toward this low inclination orbit. We've labeled here Space Launch Complex 40 here at the Cape. We've also labeled the approximate position of the drone ship, one of SpaceX's football field-sized landing vessels, positioned about 420 miles or 675 kilometers due east from the Cape. That's where the first stage booster will target landing less than 10 minutes after liftoff this morning. So here's the approximate ground track, again, a due east trajectory out over the Atlantic Ocean. SpaceX often launches to the northeast from the Cape for missions heading to the International Space Station or carrying Starlink internet satellites. But for this mission, carrying a geostationary communications satellite, the Falcon 9 will have to head east out over the Atlantic. You can see that frost level on the first stage booster rising now, and some vapors appearing from the condensation from that super cold cryogenic oxidizer as it's loaded into the first stage. We'll see that frost level rise throughout the remainder of the countdown until the liquid oxygen tank is fully loaded.
Stage 2, fuel load complete.
We heard the call a few moments ago that the second stage fuel load has been completed. So the rocket grade kerosene tank on stage 2 is now full. Shortly after that call, we saw the so-called big vent from the strongback just to the right of the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40. That's caused by the chill down conditioning of the liquid oxygen loading line that runs up that strongback from the ground storage tank where the liquid oxygen is stored at the pad up to the inlet where it flows into the liquid oxygen tank on the second stage. That line needs to be thermally conditioned before liquid oxygen begins flowing into the second stage, and that is what we're seeing now with this vent from the strongback. Liquid oxygen loading will actually begin on stage 2 in about 2 minutes. We should see this.
Spacecraft is on internal power.
We should see this vent terminated momentarily. In fact, I think we're seeing that now. That should be...
Stage 2, LOX load has started.
There we have it. Stage 2 liquid oxygen loading is now underway, concurrent with the termination of that vent from the strongback. So liquid oxygen is now flowing into the second stage of the Falcon 9. A moment before that, we heard a call from the Launch Control Center that the Hotbird 13G communications satellite is now on internal power. This is a configuration change to terminate ground power supply from an umbilical leading into the payload fairing to keep the spacecraft powered. The satellite is now being powered by its onboard batteries until it arrives in orbit and is deployed from the Falcon 9, when it will extend solar panels to begin recharging those batteries. Again, the payload for tonight's mission is Hotbird 13G. That's the 4.5 metric ton, or roughly 10,000 pound spacecraft buttoned up inside the payload fairing of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. Here's a view on the right showing this spacecraft as it was enclosed in its shipping container before leaving the Airbus factory where it was built in Toulouse, France. It's owned by Eutelsat, another French company headquartered in Paris. Eutelsat is one of the world's largest, in fact it's owns the third largest fleet of commercial communication satellites in geostationary orbit. After SES and Intelsat, Eutelsat is the third largest operator of commercial telecom satellites in geostationary orbit. This particular spacecraft is heading for a perch in geostationary orbit at 13 degrees east longitude along the equator, and it has 80 Ku band transponders to broadcast TV channels to millions of homes across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. So here's the payload one more time. This is what the Falcon 9 mission is hauling to orbit this morning from Cape Canaveral. T-minus 10 minutes and 38 seconds and counting. Coming up after the T-minus 10-minute mark, the sequence of events will start to pick up. The next major milestone in the countdown is at T-minus 7 minutes. That'll be engine chill down on the first stage. Now T-minus 8 minutes and counting. After liftoff at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, we expect to see the Falcon 9 head east from Cape Canaveral. It'll pass the speed of sound in about a minute, a little less than a minute. It'll pass the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure, also called max Q, at T plus a minute 12 seconds. And as with all Falcon 9 launches, the first stage booster will burn for about 2.5 minutes before detaching and beginning its maneuvers to come back to Earth for recovery. The second stage engine will light its single Merlin vacuum engine at T plus 2 minutes 43 seconds. About 40 seconds later, the payload fairing will jettison. That occurs after the rocket achieves space, after it flies above the dense lower layers of the atmosphere. Those two payload fairing halves will also come back to Earth for recovery. They'll be pulled from the sea after parachuting into the Atlantic Ocean for recovery and reuse. The first stage, meanwhile, will begin its descent back to Earth toward the drone ship. It'll fire its engines for an entry burn and then fire its engine again for a final landing burn. It's using its center engine, targeting touchdown on the drone ship at T plus 8 minutes 44 seconds. All this is occurring while the second stage accelerates into orbit with the Hotbird 13G spacecraft. We should see the second stage cut off at about 8 minutes after reaching a parking orbit. And at T plus 29 minutes, we expect to see a 1-minute restart of the upper stage engine to boost the Hotbird 13G spacecraft into a more elliptical transfer orbit, setting the stage for spacecraft deployment of Hotbird 13G at 36 minutes. The first stage booster flying this morning is
Stage 1, fuel load complete.
Booster 1067, which we now have just heard the fuel load on that first stage booster is complete. Liquid oxygen loading does continue. It debuted back on June the 3rd of 2021 with the launch of the CRS-22 cargo mission to the space station. It's launched 6 times in total. And notably, it's launched 2 different crew missions. 2 teams of 4 astronauts have flown on this booster on the way to the International Space Station. It also launched Turkey's Turksat 5B communications satellite, and it launched another space station cargo mission back in July. Most recently, it launched on the night of September the 18th, about a month and a half ago, with a batch of Starlink satellites. T-minus 5 minutes, 30 seconds until the launch of Hotbird 13G from Cape Canaveral, Florida.
Pressing tanks for retract.
So at this point, about 46,000 gallons of kerosene fuel have been loaded into both stages of the Falcon 9. Less than 5 minutes until liftoff. Now, the next major event will be the retraction of the strongback structure from the Falcon 9 rocket. It should begin momentarily with the
Strongback retract is starting.
There we have the call from SpaceX Launch Control. This begins with the opening of clamps at the top of that strongback to allow it to recline to an angle of about 1.5 to 1.8 degrees from the Falcon 9.
Stage 1, LOX load complete.
Now seeing that strongback reclining from the rocket, and we've heard the call that Stage 1 liquid oxygen loading is complete, so the only tank still being loaded is the Stage 2 liquid oxygen tank. That should be declared fully loaded in the next minute or so. Everything looking good for launch of the Falcon 9 at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 2.5 minutes from now. You're watching live views of Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. If you're just joining, my name is Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com. And we'll appeal one more time. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button on our stream. It helps us gain a larger following for our coverage. And also, please consider supporting our coverage by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. You can click the join button and gain access to members-only video and support our coverage here on Florida Space Coast. T-minus 2 minutes and counting until launch of SpaceX's 51st mission of the year.
Stage 2, LOX load complete.
T-minus 90 seconds.
Ground gas closeouts has started.
We've heard the call that the Falcon 9 is now fully loaded for flight. 1 million pounds of propellants have been loaded into the vehicle. At T-minus 60 seconds, the onboard computer will take command of the countdown.
Falcon is in startup.
Go for launch.
T-minus 30 seconds. We did hear the call that Falcon
30 seconds.
transition to startup mode. The onboard computer taking command of the countdown. At this point, propellant tanks should be coming up to flight pressure. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine start. And liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket carrying Eutelsat's Hotbird 13G satellite into orbit.
Falcon 9.
Nominal first stage chamber pressures.
Vehicles pitching downrange.
Falcon 9 heading downrange northeast or due east from Cape Canaveral with Hotbird 13G. And Falcon 9 has climbed above a cloud deck here over Cape Canaveral. We're still seeing the glow from the rocket as it heads downrange, though. T plus 1 minute. Falcon 9 now supersonic. It has surpassed the speed of sound. T plus 1 minute 50 seconds. About 40 seconds remaining in the first stage engine burn. We're now switching to SpaceX video. This video does come with a few seconds delay. This view from an onboard camera on the first stage, now approaching main engine cutoff. That'll be followed by stage separation and ignition of the second stage engine. Again, SpaceX's video feed does come with about a 15-second delay.
Rico.
Stage separation confirmed.
We've heard
Ignition.
verbal confirmation of staging and ignition of the second stage engine. We expect to see that. Here we see it in video a few moments later. Again, the video comes with a bit of a lag. There's stage separation and ignition of the Merlin vacuum engine to continue the climb into orbit with Hotbird 13G. The first stage is coming back to Earth, targeting a landing on a drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean.
Fairing separation confirmed.
And we've heard the call to confirm jettison of the payload fairing. That's the nose cone that enclosed Hotbird 13G for the initial climb into space, and we expect to see that jettison. There it is, the payload fairing falling away from Hotbird 13G, which is the gold structure you see there. The gold-colored structure, that was some of the thermal blankets on Hotbird 13G. Now a view of the Merlin vacuum engine firing. To power Hotbird 13G into orbit.
Vehicle on nominal trajectory.
Now 6 minutes into the flight of the Falcon 9 rocket with Hotbird 13G. Everything looking really good so far with this mission. The first stage is making its descent toward the drone ship. This map from SpaceX shows the positions of the first stage booster and the upper stage. The first stage, in a few moments, should be igniting its engines for an entry burn to begin slowing down for re-entry back into the atmosphere.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
And there's the ignition of 3 engines on the first stage for this entry burn. This is slowing the rocket
Stage
down
1 entry burn shut down.
For its descent back into the atmosphere. You can see the velocity meter on the lower left, that display decreasing rapidly with this burn. The upper stage engine continuing its firing to achieve orbital velocity with the Hotbird 13G communications satellite. Now, more than 7 minutes into the flight, about a minute to a minute and a half remaining until landing of the first stage. We're also about 30 to 40 seconds away from the expected time of engine cutoff on the second stage. That will result in the placement of the Eutelsat Hotbird 13G broadcasting satellite into a preliminary parking orbit.
Stage 1 transonic.
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
Vico.
Stage 1 landing burn.
for the call of second stage engine cutoff or SECO on the second stage, and the start of the landing burn that uses the center engine on the
Landing
first
like
stage
deployed.
booster. Here's a view now of it coming in for landing on the drone ship. Beautiful view there
Nominal orbit
Stage 1 landing
insertion.
confirmed.
from the onboard camera.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
And landing confirmed. Falcon 9 is back on Earth. It is touchdown on the drone ship. Just read the instructions. About 420 miles downrange due east from Cape Canaveral in the Atlantic Ocean. This completes the 7th flight to space for this booster, booster 1067 in SpaceX's fleet of reusable rockets. And it's the 152nd booster landing, successful booster landing overall in SpaceX history. A great view there from the drone ship of the booster on the deck. That vessel will be returning to Port Canaveral the next couple of days with this rocket on board for refurbishment inside one of SpaceX's hangars here at the Cape and for preparations for a future flight. The second stage, meanwhile, is in orbit after reaching orbital velocity with Hotbird 13G. It's now coasting for about 20 minutes or so before the engine relights at T plus 29 minutes. You can see in this map the second stage is coasting over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Once it reaches a position near the west coast of Africa, that engine will reignite for about a 60-second burn to power Hotbird 13G into its higher altitude orbit for payload deployment. Again, spacecraft separation is planned at T plus 36 minutes. That's when SpaceX officials will be able to declare success on tonight's launch.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
We're going to stay live with our coverage for the remainder of this mission. Again, payload deployment separation of Hotbird 13G is expected at T plus 36 minutes. That is going to be at 1:58 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:58 a.m. UTC. Now 21 minutes, 30 seconds since the liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral with the Hotbird 13G communications satellite on board for Eutelsat. Here's a look at some of the mission statistics for this morning's flight. This was the 184th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket since the very first Falcon 9 launch back on June the 4th of 2010. It was the 193rd launch using a member of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family since 2006. That tally includes Falcon 1, Falcon 9, and Falcon Heavy. This was the 7th launch and landing of this particular booster, Booster 1067. This was the 157th Falcon 9 launch from here in Florida, the 102nd SpaceX launch from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and the 155th launch overall from Pad 40, which previously hosted launches of the Air Force's Titan rocket family. Again, this booster tonight was flying for the 7th time, so it's the 125th mission to utilize a reused booster in SpaceX history. This was the 152nd landing of a Falcon booster since the very first successful recovery of a first stage back in 2015. This is the 4th SpaceX launch for Eutelsat, the owner of this Hotbird 13G TV broadcasting spacecraft. This was the 51st SpaceX Falcon 9 launch of the year. Actually, the 51st SpaceX launch overall this year. That includes 50 Falcon 9s and 51
Acquisition of signal, Gabon.
launches overall, including the Falcon Heavy we saw take off earlier this week. And the 48th orbital launch attempt from Cape Canaveral overall this year. This extends the record for launch activity in a calendar year here in Florida. The previous record was 32. This was the 48th, again, orbital launch attempt from the Cape or Kennedy Space Center in 2022. That includes SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, and Astra. This was also the 55th space launch attempt from Florida Space Coast in the last 365 days. So the 48th of this calendar year, the 55th in the last 365 days, dating back to this date in 2021. So those are the mission stats for this mission this morning with Eutelsat's Hotbird 13G spacecraft. The clock is now passing T plus 24 minutes. We're about 5 minutes away from the expected time of reignition of the Falcon 9's upper stage engine. We heard a call a few moments ago that the rocket is now within telemetry range of a tracking station in Libreville in Gabon. That's on the west coast of Africa. Later on, we expect to hear a call out that the rocket is within range of a ground station in Hartbeespoort, South Africa, and that ground station will likely be receiving signals from the rocket as it deploys Eutelsat's Hotbird 13G satellite. We hope to get live video through that ground station from the rocket showing the spacecraft deployment event at T plus 36 minutes. That's about 11 minutes from now when we expect to see payload separation. We're now about 4 minutes away from the restart of the upper stage engine.
Start of MVAC chill.
The most recent call we heard a few seconds ago from launch control is that the Merlin vacuum engine chill down is underway. This is a thermal conditioning of that engine for its upcoming burn. We're now seeing some live views from a camera on board the Falcon 9 rocket's upper stage, showing some venting from the Merlin engine. This is the chill down procedure underway to thermally condition that engine for ignition in about a minute or so from now. Standing by for ignition in roughly 30 seconds. Less than 30 seconds now.
And back startup.
And there is verbal confirmation from launch control of startup or ignition of the Merlin vacuum engine. We hope to see video of that shortly. The video again comes with a bit of a delay. And there's the Merlin vacuum engine lighting for this critical burn. This is an orbit raising maneuver to raise the apogee or high point of the orbit of the rocket and the Hotbird 13G spacecraft to an altitude of more than 30,000 miles. That's the target, more than 50,000 kilometers for this minute-long burn of the MVAC or Merlin vacuum engine on stage 2 of the Falcon 9 rocket. Now halfway through this burn, the Merlin engine produces about 220,000 pounds of thrust.
Shutdown.
We've heard verbal confirmation of
Insertion.
engine shutdown. There we see it, and we heard the call also for nominal orbit insertion. That's a critical call that the Falcon 9 has achieved the expected orbital parameters, the expected altitude and expected inclination for separation of Hotbird 13G, which is now roughly 5.5 minutes away. You can see the rocket is currently flying over Africa, heading southeast. We expect to see the Hotbird 13G spacecraft separate from the Falcon 9 in about 5 minutes' time.
Acquisition of signal, Liftoff.
And there's the call, just as we said a few moments ago. The Falcon 9 is now in range of the downrange tracking station in Hartebeespoort, South Africa. As you can see, the Falcon 9's upper stage is currently flying in daylight over Africa after its middle of the night launch from here on Florida Space Coast. Now about 90 seconds to 2 minutes away from payload deployment. That deployment is expected at T plus 36 minutes, 11 seconds. About a minute and a half from now.
Expected loss of signal, Gabon.
Now standing by for payload separation. We're seeing live views once more from SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. There you have it, looking down at the blue marble of Earth against the blackness of space. And there's Hotbird 13G in the foreground. We should see that separating from the launch vehicle in the next 15 seconds or so.
Payload separation confirmed.
And there you see Hotbird 13G deploying from SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with the continent of Africa, the Indian Ocean there in the background.
Acquisition of signal, Diego Garcia.
This Airbus-built satellite is heading toward geosynchronous orbit. It will use plasma propulsion to reach that orbit over the next few months before entering commercial service, providing TV broadcast services next year. Beautiful shot there, the Great Rift Valley of Africa, the Indian Ocean, some cloud cover there as the Falcon 9 and Hotbird 13G are now climbing farther into space, 1,250 kilometers above the Earth at this point and climbing. This rocket was expected to put the satellite into a super synchronous transfer orbit, stretching more than 30,000 miles from Earth at its highest point. And SpaceX did report an on-target orbital insertion on tonight's mission. Here's a view from SpaceX showing a map of the location of the second stage of the Falcon 9 and the location also of Hotbird 13G, currently overflying Madagascar, again after crossing the continent of Africa in the last few minutes. So all indications are this was a successful launch from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this morning at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC. Here's a shot of the empty pad at pad 40, where the Falcon 9 lifted off a little more than 38 minutes ago. This was SpaceX's 51st mission of the year, the second this week. SpaceX had pointing out toward pad 40, we're now showing a view of pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. So again, just to recap, we saw the Falcon 9 take off from pad 40, a few miles to the south of 39A at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time with the Hotbird 13G satellite. By all indications, it was a successful launch. Hotbird 13G was placed into an on-target supersynchronous transfer orbit, according to SpaceX. Ground teams at the Airbus Control Center at the near the factory where the spacecraft was built in France will take control of the spacecraft over the next few moments, and the spacecraft will be heading toward geosynchronous orbit next year, using plasma propulsion to maneuver into its final orbital position to provide TV broadcast services for Eutelsat over Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. This was the second of 3 SpaceX launches this year, this fall, this autumn, for Eutelsat. We saw a twin satellite called Hotbird 13F launch back on October the 15th, and later this month, another Eutelsat communications satellite called Eutelsat 10B is slated to launch on a Falcon 9 from here at the Cape. The next launch from here on Florida Space Coast is targeted for no earlier than Tuesday, November the 8th. That's when a Falcon 9 rocket is slated to launch from Pad 40 again, with 2 commercial communication satellites for Intelsat. These will be TV broadcasting satellites to cover the United States for Intelsat. Galaxy 31 and 32 will be stacked one on top of the other for this dual satellite mission on a Falcon 9 rocket. Also looking ahead on our launch calendar, next week on Sunday, Northrop Grumman is scheduled to launch an Antares rocket from Wallops Flight Facility in the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport in Virginia, carrying a Cygnus spacecraft on the NG-18 mission, a resupply mission to the International Space Station. Also next week, no earlier than November the 9th, pending range availability out at Vandenberg Space Force Base, United Launch Alliance is scheduled to launch an Atlas V rocket with NOAA's JPSS-2 weather satellite. That's a civilian weather observatory for NOAA. Also on that mission is a reentry tech demo experiment called Lofted. That's a partnership between ULA and NASA. And one of the big events later this month is the scheduled launch of NASA's Artemis 1 mission on the Space Launch System moon rocket, following a series of unsuccessful launch attempts back in August and September. Those were cut short by a fuel leak, a hydrogen fuel leak in the transfer line, the loading line between the ground systems and the rocket. That leak was repaired, and NASA hoped to launch the mission again in early October, early October, but that was thwarted by Hurricane Ian. NASA had to roll this rocket back into the vehicle assembly building for safekeeping. They also did some repair work and refurbishment on the rocket in the VAB the last few weeks. And the 322-foot tall Space Launch System is set to roll out of the vehicle assembly building on the way back to Pad B here at Kennedy Space Center tomorrow. Shortly after midnight is the current target time for the departure of the Space Launch System from the VAB for the roughly 10-hour journey out to Pad 39B in preparation for a launch attempt for the Artemis 1 test flight to the moon, an unpiloted demonstration flight of the Space Launch System on November the 14th, shortly after midnight. The launch window opens at 12:07 a.m. Eastern Time from Kennedy Space Center, and we'll be bringing you live coverage of that launch as well. So here's a look once more at the calendar of launches coming up in the next couple of weeks. Again, the next launch from here on Florida Space Coast is set for Tuesday. That'll be a Falcon 9 rocket with Intelsat's Galaxy 31 and 32 communications satellites. So with that, we're going to sign off from our coverage this morning at Kennedy Space Center. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now. Thanks for joining us for the countdown and launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with Eutelsat's Hotbird 13G television broadcasting satellite. Our next live event is scheduled for tomorrow, the rollout of the Space Launch System we'll be bringing that to you live on our YouTube channel. So until then, have a great night or morning wherever you are. We'll see you soon.